Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second History Happy Hour of the fall and winter season. My name is Rob Williams, and I serve as Director of Outreach here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. For those new to our Zoom Happy Hours, we've been hosting them. We're entering our third season of hosting them through the cooler months as a means to connect with supporters who aren't visiting the battlefield when it's I think it's about 29 degrees wind chill right now, as well as with those who regularly support us from a distance. We appreciate any kind of support, near and far, and always any opportunity to be able to connect. As we enter the holiday season, we're winding down for the year, but it isn't over yet. 2 weeks ago, we hosted our second annual 24 Hours on the Ridge, in which the museum remained open overnight rather than closing at 5 o'clock. And this annual fundraiser has become one of the biggest events of the year. And if you weren't able to join us this year or last year, you're in luck. We're absolutely going to be doing it again next year. And while we don't have a date set for it quite yet, I can confirm that unlike the first two, next year will be held on the weekend. So it's going to be available to many more people who would like to come. Plans and ideas are certainly in motion, and we'll announce a date as soon as we possibly can. Our final two events of the year will see another History Happy Hour on Friday, December 16th, in which our Executive Director, Pete Mealy, will discuss post-battle Gettysburg through the eyes of Reverend Charles Alfred Baer, who traveled to the seminary from the Philadelphia area in the weeks following the battle. And 2 weeks from today, the Gettysburg Christmas Festival will once again fill the streets from December 2nd to December 4th at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. On Saturday the 3rd, we'll be having free cookie and Christmas ornament decorating, hot chocolate and warm apple cider, horse-drawn carriage rides all up here on the campus. It's going to be a great spot to park and catch the shuttle into town. And of course, the museum will be open. Lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our robust membership program. If you like what you see or hear or would like to support us further, we have many opportunities for giving and participating, which I will link in the comments and Cody has on the screen right now. Speaking of Cody, it's time to get on with the show. And Cody serves as Director of Education and Museum Operations here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center and is coming up on his 10th anniversary at the museum. He's been here since before the doors opened, and his experience reflects that. If a question is asked around here, whether it's staff or visitor, and the answer isn't known, the immediate follow-up is ask Cody. Tonight, he presents the story of Gettysburg's first Confederate monument. We will make sure to allow for questions at the end. You'll be able to unmute yourselves and ask if you would like, or if you'd both like to put them in the chat or send them as a message, you're welcome to do that. And I'll be here to help if anybody needs any help. So thank you very much again for your support and participation. Cody?
All right. Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you all for being here this evening. It's wonderful to be part of another History Happy Hour as we go on through the end of our visitation season traditionally, but the fact that we're able to take this into the fall and winter, presenting fascinating topics, bringing in some wonderful guest presenters as we go through the winter. It's really a joy to be able to do these programs and step outside the confines of what we often present here at Seminary Ridge, not just stories pertaining to what you'll see as you go through the exhibit spaces or on one of our walking tours. We can go sort of outside the bounds of Seminary Ridge. We're not going to go terribly outside those bounds today, though, only about a mile or so southeast of us to Culp's Hill. And we're going to go to 26 years after the battle. And in fact, tomorrow, the anniversary, of course, of the Gettysburg Address, but it is also on that occasion in 1886 that the first monument to Confederate veterans is dedicated on the Gettysburg battlefield. And as we go through this evening, there are really a couple of major themes that I want to hit on, some major takeaways that I hope everyone will have. But I would say that more than anything, if you're going to walk away with one thing of a feather in your cap to take away from this evening, it is that this is a microcosm of the Gettysburg monument story overall, but also of the Confederate monument story nationally. This is just one instance. It's one dedication we're going to talk about. It's one monument, but the pushback that veterans get for dedicating it the things that Union veterans and the press will say about it, both favorably and otherwise, as we will see, as well as how it's perceived just in Gettysburg as part of the Gettysburg visitation experience. What does having Confederate monuments add or detract, as many would see it, from the Gettysburg visitation experience overall? But I also want to take a moment before we dive into all of that to look at this regiment. Who were these men? Why did they feel it was necessary to dedicate their monument here? And also, of course, looking at the fact that why does it take 26 years and what are the ramifications of that? So we're going to pack a lot into the next 45 minutes or so. But I do want to just say from the outset, this is a controversial subject, as we all, of course, know. There are many opinions that we still have today over the matters of the Civil War, by virtue of the fact that the Civil War itself was, of course, a controversial event. Hundreds of thousands of people died, hundreds of thousands of people, who are citizens of the same country, killed one another over the matters of the Civil War. And so these are controversial affairs that we have at the heart of this discussion. And of course, along with that, we see the cyclical nature of every generation having its own debates, its own controversies, its own conversations over matters including monuments and especially those pertaining to the Confederacy. Now, where I want to begin is with the story of a man named George Matthews. George Matthews visits Gettysburg with his friends, as so many of us, of course, have at Gettysburg and other battlefields. And he's trekking Culp's Hill when he notices the monument to the 1st Maryland Battalion, otherwise known as the 2nd Maryland Infantry, the monument that you see in front of you as it appears today on the lower summit of Culp's Hill. He notices as he's walking up the hill with his friends that the monument has been vandalized, that it is besmeared, as he says. He doesn't tell us how. Perhaps it's covered in paint, perhaps it's scratched. We're not exactly sure, but it was in some way vandalized. And George Matthews, in writing about this experience, he responds with a great deal of frustration, essentially saying that whoever did this must not have appreciated their history. They must not have been able to forgive and forget the events of long ago, of decades ago. And he says that they were mistaken, in his words, in the perception of their beliefs. This is a story, and the likes of this story, that we could strip from the headlines of any newspaper over the past several years, especially the period between 2015 and 2017, and then again, of course, in 2020, when we're having national reckonings, national conversations over race, over the legacy of slavery, and with that, Confederate iconography. But this was not in a recent time. This was in February of 1891 that George Matthews is visiting the Gettysburg battlefield. Just 28 years had passed since the battle. Just 5 years had passed since this monument was dedicated. And as George Matthews wrote in the Cambrian magazine, that he was in company with some Union soldiers, we visited Culp's Hill, where at that time the only Confederate monument was erected. He says, someone with more hatred than love in his bosom besmeared the Confederate stone. One of my friends and a Union man who had fought there said, "What a shame. If it were possible, I would wash it off." Such is the influence, says Matthews, of a quarter of a century at least, some who fought their mistaken brothers. This is another major takeaway, that right, wrong, or indifferent, the ways that we deal, sometimes some folks physically, with the debates over Confederate iconography, including besmearing them, as he says, the images that we see over the past couple of years, this is nothing new. These sorts of ideas that people have about opposing Confederate monumentation started with the wartime generation itself, just like the debates that we continue to have all go back to the unfinished conversations that the wartime generation itself, that Civil War veterans had themselves. The first people who opposed Confederate monuments were the people who themselves opposed Confederate soldiers on the battlefield, including here at Gettysburg. Now, throughout the course of this evening, we're going to focus, of course, on the monument itself and the aftermath of it. But let's take a brief look first at the men who dedicated the monument and to whom it is dedicated in turn. It's the 1st Maryland Infantry that is the inception of the regiment that ultimately fights here at Gettysburg, known as the 1st Maryland Battalion or the 2nd Maryland Infantry. And we'll talk about that name change and the kind of confusion over the identification of this regiment. But in the days immediately after Abraham Lincoln calls for the initial troops for United States forces to quell the rebellion in 1861, there are a number of Maryland companies that are raised. Now, of course, as many of you know, Maryland remains a border state, that is, remaining loyal to the United States, a unionist population by and large, but where slavery does still exist and in rather large numbers in some cases. And we can utilize the 1860 slave census map available through the Library of Congress, loc.gov, a portion of which is excerpted on the left-hand side of your screen. And we can look at Maryland and we can see that the further north you go, the lower the slave population, the lighter the color of the county, the lower the number, which would be the percentage of enslaved in that county. And the further south you go, the more you go toward Virginia and Delaware, the higher the enslaved population is, in excess of 50% for some of those counties in the southern portion of Maryland. By and large, the soldiers of the 1st Maryland Infantry are from two of the larger cities in Maryland, Baltimore and Frederick. But as time goes on, we do see the enlistment for many Confederate Maryland units, which will, of course, be a state that sends men to both the United States and the Confederate militaries. We will see higher percentages come from those counties that have higher percentages of enslaved people will side to fight with the Confederacy. These initial companies are raised in the spring and summer of 1861. And in part, they're heavily influenced and have this kind of anti-unionist, this more rebellious Southern Confederate streak for some of them who had witnessed events like the Pratt Street riots at Baltimore in 1861, seeing an overreach of federal authority, as many of them saw it. And none other than George Stewart, nicknamed Maryland Stewart, who would, of course, command a brigade at Gettysburg, the brigade in which the 1st Maryland Battalion is, the regiment that erects this monument. He is commanding militia and will be inspired in part by witnessing these events in 1861 to raise the initial companies for this 1st Maryland Infantry. We can see on the screen here the two, actually the 2nd and 3rd commanders of the regiment. The 1st regimental commander was Francis Thomas, who is removed from command. He's unpopular among a few of the companies. And then as a member of Joseph Johnston's staff at the Battle of Bull Run, or First Battle of Manassas in July 1861, he's killed. We can see pictured here the two men who led this regiment for much of its history, which only lasted for a year, which is rare in Confederate enlistments. Typically, Confederate soldiers enlisted for the duration of the conflict. The 1st Maryland Infantry enlisted, not as a Confederate state, of course, was able to have its own period of enlistment, and it was for 1 year. Arnold Elzey on your left-hand side, who was promoted to brigadier general after First Bull Run or Manassas, he'll command the regiment initially. And then Bradley Johnson is the officer on your right side, who was most often associated with this regiment, and is going to be the individual who really kind of forges the identity of the 1st Maryland Infantry. They'll be involved in Stonewall Jackson's 1862 Valley campaign, as well as the Peninsula campaign that spring and early summer. But their enlistment, as I mentioned, is only for 1 year, and it will end in August 1862 effectively. And this leads to a conundrum. These men had agreed to a fight for the Confederacy, which is for the duration of the war, but their state enlistment was only for a year. They also faced the conundrum of returning as a Confederate soldier, as someone who fought against the armies of the United States, returning to a unionist state, that is a state that remained loyal to the federal government. And so many of these men who were veterans of the 1st Maryland, they will re-enlist into cavalry units and artillery units, but especially we're going to see an outgrowth of a second new regiment that is based upon the 1st Maryland Infantry, and that is the 1st Maryland Battalion. Battalion indicating the fact that it's smaller than the size of a regiment, and it's largely based on recruits that had served in that initial 1st Maryland Infantry for a year. These men have a relatively quiet winter of 1862 into 1863. They're not involved in really any sizable engagements. They're mostly encamped in the Shenandoah Valley that winter. But then come the next spring into the summer of 1863, the opening of the Gettysburg campaign, in the Shenandoah Valley, they are going to be involved heavily at the Second Battle of Winchester, June 13th to 15th, that battle that famously sort of opens Robert E. Lee's door into Pennsylvania to send Richard Ewell's corps down the valley northward into Pennsylvania amid the invasion of Pennsylvania that ends here at the Battle of Gettysburg. They're going to be followed one day after the conclusion of the Battle of Winchester with a march through Shepherdstown in West Virginia, which is, of course, a new state at this point in time in 1863. And they approach the Potomac River at Baudelaires Ford on June 18th. And that's when they're going to cross the Potomac into Maryland, led by the men that you see here on your screen. Now, one figure who I will note now while we see his face, the second man from your left, Major William Goldsborough, W.W. Goldsborough, he becomes the official chronicler, the historian, not just of this regiment, this battalion, but of what is called the Maryland Line, which is the entire collection of Maryland units that fought for the Confederacy. And so much of what we know about their service does come to us from the extensive writings of Goldsborough in 1869, relatively soon after the Civil War. Another thing to note is that the first 3 men pictured on your left will all leave this regiment at Gettysburg. In fact, between July 2nd and July 3rd, a total of 5 individual officers will leave this regiment on Culp's Hill due to casualties. One after another, they are wounded, and in the case of Goldsborough, wounded and captured. Now, as they march into Pennsylvania, we can trace their path on this map. Goldsborough said that when the battalion was marching through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, it felt a range of emotions, from, in his words, the joy that baffled description upon reaching the Maryland line, to sorrow when the men passed through the town of Sharpsburg and halted upon the famous battlefield, of course, referring to Antietam, fought the previous September. He says, while moving through Hagerstown, they were heartily received, though in other towns, locals scowled fiercely upon us, and no doubt wished every rebel son of us to the devil. On June 23rd, they crossed into Pennsylvania, maneuvered northward for the better part of the next week, making it to the outskirts of Carlisle. And then on June 30, they will backtrack with large portions of Richard Buell's corps back toward Chambersburg, ultimately making their way east toward Gettysburg on June 30th as Robert E. Lee's army is beginning to concentrate. Goldsborough says that this was sort of a disappointing march. He says, we at first assumed we were returning to Virginia without a fight, but then soon came to the conclusion that the army might have been about to move on Baltimore and Washington. And Goldsborough has an interesting distinction, and many of these men have a distinction of having personal connections. Because they're from Maryland, just a few miles south of the Mason-Dixon line, south of Gettysburg, of course, is the Mason-Dixon line. Goldsborough would write that he had an intimate knowledge of the surrounding areas. In my youth, he said, I had more than once traveled almost every road in York, Adams, and Franklin counties, and was therefore familiar with them all. So we talk about the Pennsylvania units that are fighting at home at Gettysburg, but in some instances, such as these Maryland men, we can see an intimate knowledge of the area as well in their cases. Now, on July 1st, they are not going to be engaged. They're not going to get here until after the fighting has effectively concluded, just before dusk. But he says that Goldsborough says they had passed by James Longstreet's corps around Fayetteville to the west of Gettysburg. They get into town. The fighting has concluded. He talks about seeing the number of wounded United States soldiers. These Union troops are lying about the field. They can pass by a few hospitals along Chambersburg Pike and through the town of Gettysburg. And it becomes extraordinarily evident to them that they're walking into a bloody battle if it should continue the next day. Goldsborough would say that they advanced toward the York Pike and the Hanover Road on the eastern side of Gettysburg. And while in town, Goldsborough is going to engage in conversation with Henry Stall, editor of the Gettysburg Compiler, a Democratic paper, but extremely conservative. Of course, the parties realigned since that point in time. The Gettysburg Compiler is the Democratic conservative paper in the town. And Goldsborough is going to engage in this conversation with Stall. He says that a town of gaping citizens soon surrounded us, imagining Mr. Stall was hatching treason. Here we have a local newspaper editor talking with the occupying, invading Confederate force. He says Mr. Stall was forthwith reported to authorities. And as many of you know, he's arrested. He's taken to Fort McHenry in Baltimore in prison until late July. But when Stall returns the next month, through the remainder of the Civil War, especially with emancipation occurring in 1863, and then throughout Reconstruction in the years that followed the Civil War, Stahl will become aggressively more prejudicial in his press. He's going to enlist the N-word repeatedly. He's going to be on the side of segregation and opposed to full citizenship for African Americans. And when Henry Stahl is going to be mentioned in Goldsborough's memoir, it's interesting that Goldsborough says in 1869, so amid Reconstruction, when he's recounting his Gettysburg experience, Goldsborough praises Stahl's, in his words, manly and independent tone of his paper. And so this might tell us something about how these Marylanders, these Confederate Marylanders, are feeling about their views on the cause and consequence of the war itself. Now, on July 2nd, the men are actually going to be involved in the battle. And this is moving toward the location where they will ultimately place their monument at Culp's Hill. Around 10 o'clock, they make a reconnaissance of the Federal lines. They move across Rock Creek. He says, does Goldsborough, that this was ground covered with immense rocks, and they waded waist deep across the creek itself, where a sharp fight ensued. We were rapidly approaching Culp's Hill through one of the densest woods I have ever passed. And as darkness is now approaching, daylight has passed. The worst of the fighting at Culp's Hill is just beginning. Darkness was upon us, says Goldsborough. Nothing could be seen save the flash of an occasional musket in our front. He says, in an instant, the heavens were lighted up by the flash of thousands of muskets. The column reveled and staggered like a drunken man as men fell like autumn leaves throughout the night. But they will get to the Union breastworks that had been dug by George Greene's brigade on Culp's Hill that evening. They are going to successfully take one of those and are just about 50 yards away from Federal forces in their front as the night wears on. Just before dawn on July 3rd, the fighting is now going to erupt in what will become, notably, the longest sustained fighting of the Civil War to this point. For roughly the next 6-7 hours, heavy fighting is going to consume the slopes of Culp's Hill, only to be surpassed about 10 months later by the fighting at the Bloody Angle at Spotsylvania Courthouse. But this is sustained, heavy fighting that these Maryland men, the other comrades that they have in Virginia and North Carolina units in their brigade, against the Federal troops that are holding the slopes of Culp's Hill. Goldsborough says that the whole hillside seemed enveloped in a blaze. The trees were riddled. The balls could be heard to strike the breastworks like hailstones upon rooftops. The fire was returned as best we could, but it was almost certain death to expose any vital part of the body. One man who enters this story and will eventually play a key role in the monument that these soldiers place is Randolph McKim, a famous Gettysburg name, working as a staff officer at this point in time on the brigade. And he says of witnessing what the Marylanders do that morning of July 3rd, I would like to pay tribute to the splendid fortitude of the 2nd Maryland Infantry. Then and there was the supreme exhibition of their soldierly qualities. Goldsborough is given an order when he's given command, as I mentioned, 5 separate commanders, including Goldsborough, for these Marylanders that morning of July 3rd. Attrition will weigh heavily upon their ranks. He's given an order to move across the open expanse of ground now known as Pardee Field. And he says that I considered the order murder and therefore would take my men in under protest. The men made their way slowly, sometimes crawling to the spot where they were to be senselessly slaughtered. They're fewer than 200 yards from the Federal line. Goldsborough says, I had feelings I had never before experienced on the battlefield, for I felt that I had but a minute to live. They're going to make an attack across that field. It's been immortalized in art. We'll look at a couple of those art pieces here momentarily. It's a famous moment of this July 3rd fighting at Gettysburg, as the advance of these Marylanders across Pardee Field and their ultimate repulse amid a bloody attack and defense. He says that the battalion withdrew, suffering about 50% casualties, stubbornly contesting every foot of ground until we reached Rock Creek. Darkness put an end to the conflict. Such was the part taken by the 2nd Maryland in the great and bloody Battle of Gettysburg. They're going to retreat with the rest of Johnson's division, Ewell's Corps, back through town to Seminary Ridge, really to here at the Lutheran Seminary. And then the retreat of Confederate forces will commence on July 4th and 5th. And that is their Gettysburg experience. In the aftermath of the fighting at Culp's Hill, more so than any other place on the battlefield, the physical landscape attested to the severity of the battle. And this would play out in photographs. as we can see a few of them here, the natural damage that played out across the slopes of Culp's Hill. But what we oftentimes see in these black and white images, this highly visible physical damage, what we don't often get out of that are the colorful, descriptive, sometimes grotesque accounts, almost more than any other place on this battlefield or most other Civil War battlefields, of what these soldiers endured and the lasting resonance of the fight at Culp's Hill as a truly brutal place. And one of the reasons that this was the case for these Marylanders is that this is a location that we have Maryland fighting Maryland, a number of federal Maryland units on the field, on this section of the field, one of which is the 1st Maryland Eastern Shore Regiment. Colonel James Wallace would write on July 4th, just a day later, the 1st Maryland Confederate Regiment met us and were cut to pieces. We sorrowfully gathered up many of our old friends and acquaintances and had them carefully and tenderly cared for. Likewise, Edward Simmons of that same regiment, 1st Maryland Eastern Shore, said that our regiment met the 1st Maryland Regiment, rebel regiment, killed and wounded nearly all of them. I can hear the cry of the wounded around. Just here on my left is a pile of amputated limbs, some 20 or 30 in number, about a dozen ghastly, mutilated corpses, while in front is a lot of men, some with one arm gone, some with none. It is indeed a fearful sight, I tell you. This is not playing soldier. The horrid sights that meet the eye almost freeze the blood in one's veins. For these soldiers who fought at Culp's Hill, this is a poignant, dark location. Many of them will suffer with the images of Culp's Hill for years. And in a case where we see Maryland fighting Maryland, we can see maybe why this would particularly be the case for some of these soldiers. Some of the other fascinating, in a very macabre way, stories that come out of this include Michael Schroyer of the 147th Pennsylvania. Some of you are probably familiar with the story of witnessing a Confederate soldier commit suicide right in front of him. And it seems like this soldier was probably one of these Maryland Battalion members. Brigadier General Thomas Kane, in a moment of humanity on this battlefield, talks about the regimental mascot, a dog named Grace, for these 1st Maryland Battalion soldiers, who is perfectly riddled with bullets, in his words. They will take care of this dog and then bury it as the only Christian-minded being on either side, in Kane's words. An unidentified soldier in the 111th Pennsylvania, which fought against these Maryland Confederate soldiers, just identifies himself as John, writes a letter home 2 weeks later in which he says, I spent my 4th of July by celebrating on the 3rd all day by killing rebels. It was the greatest display of fireworks that was ever witnessed in Pennsylvania. And then I spent a part of the 4th roaming over the battlefield looking at dead rebs. This gives us a sense of the dark, macabre sense of especially what happened on Culp's Hill. These images and others like them, including some of the art that would come about in the aftermath, give us a visual sense of Culp's Hill. It's a heavily visited location in the aftermath of the battle. It's one of those spots that if you wanted to see the impact of what minute balls and artillery shells could do upon the physical landscape, this was an effective spot to do it. But behind that, concealed in the words of these men, is just how horrific of a lived experience what being at Culp's Hill was. And of course, these are famous images from Edwin Forbes, a number of sketches that he created that would then be turned into watercolors, such as those that you can see here. And the men of the Maryland, 1st Maryland Battalion, 2nd Maryland Infantry, they likewise are featured in a number of artistic depictions, including the two that you see on screen here. They're essentially the same image with some differences. You can see quite a number of similarities between the two, published a few decades apart from one another. But these are two of the examples. There's also a famous Peter Rothermel painting of this regiment and their charge at Culp's Hill that's at the State Museum in Harrisburg. Don Troiani did a painting called Band of Brothers that depicts these men as well as their dog, as well as Grace. So does the Rothermel painting has Grace. So it's a regiment that really does pick up from the get-go, early on, sort of artistic piece, artistic quality to their story. Now, bigger picture, moving to the post-war years and how we get to a Confederate monument and how it becomes these men who dedicate it. The Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association is, of course, established in the days, really, the weeks and months, especially after the battle. And its goal, one of its goals, it says, was to maintain memorial structures as a generous and patriotic people may aid to erect and promote the erection by voluntary contributions of structures and works of art and taste, building tasteful monuments that tell a story, if we put that into so many words. And veterans would do this on your left side of your screen with etchings in rocks, such as that one to where Strong Vincent fell, etched sometime probably in 1864 at Little Round Top. On the right-hand side of your screen, we have Oliver Otis Howard about to dedicate the cornerstone of Soldiers National Monument. 1865, the cornerstone is dedicated. 4 years later, the full monument goes up. And in 1867, the first regimental monument on the battlefield, pictured in the center there, October 1867, men from the 1st Minnesota are going to erect their monument. The irony here, kind of, we can chuckle at it today, is that this monument is accepted hesitantly on the grounds that, quote, the one great national monument, meaning the Soldiers' National Monument, will be all that is necessary in the way of commemoration. The Battlefield Memorial Association assumes no other unit, no other state other than this national monument will probably ever be created. Of course, the reason why we can look at that with some humor today is Gettysburg has about 1,300 monuments, markers, and memorials to soldiers in both the United States and Confederate armies. Nevertheless, Gettysburg at this point in time is seen largely as a United States Veterans Memorial Park. GBMA, going back to what it said its mission was. The Battle of Gettysburg, said the Battlefield Memorial Association, with its severe and desperate fighting and terrible slaughter and suffering, was unsurpassed during the war. The result of the battle was a severe blow to the cause of the rebellion, and as such was selected as at an early period for preservation, and has attracted more attention and been visited by more people than all the other battlefields of rebellion. It's the Union victory. It's the fact that the Republic was saved there, says the GBMA, that this battlefield should have monuments, that it should be a place of commemoration. It's to the Union soldiers who quelled the rebellion. It's not a place of Confederate memory. That's not its intention when Gettysburg is initially preserved. But this will start to change inadvertently at first. In 1869, as I mentioned, the Soldiers' National Monument is fully dedicated. Its keynote speaker is going to be the man you see in the process of delivering his speech there, Major General George Ward Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac, U.S. forces here at the Battle of Gettysburg. And he is going to tell his audience that day, it's the section you see highlighted of his speech there in so many words, that the one major problem he has is that as he goes about the battlefield, the only dead who are buried in specific locations that are marked are the United States Army dead. The men against whom we fought, he says, are not buried in any one consolidated location. And so he proposes we collect them in some suitable place, but specifies, I do not ask that a monument be erected over them. I do not ask that we should in any way endorse their cause or their conduct or entertain other than feelings of condemnation for their course, but they are dead. He's saying, move the Confederate dead, don't erect a monument, but get them out of the battlefield to some consolidated location, i.e. a cemetery. And we might wonder if this is controversial to Confederate veterans. But by and large, in these initial years after the war, there's a lack of interest, there's a lack of funding, there's a lack of wanting to do anything at Gettysburg by Confederate veterans, even so much as visit. In 1869, there is a veterans reunion. Only 3 Confederate veterans showed up. Now that's an early blue-gray reunion. It's the earliest one that there is at Gettysburg. They're going out on a limb 4 years after the Civil War, inviting officers of both armies to come together. But it will be on that occasion that the likes of Robert E. Lee says in his words that he thought it wiser not to keep open the sores of war, to commit to oblivion the feeling that the Civil War engendered. And Lee's son, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, he specifically states that he doesn't think it's a good idea to, in his words, perpetuate in granite proofs to civil wars. But as we go further through Reconstruction, and eventually when Reconstruction is over, when Southerners see it as being defeated, then we will start to see an interest in visiting Gettysburg and in dedicating Confederate monuments. One Confederate veteran would say in 1880, just after Reconstruction has effectively ended, talks about Northern painters, sculptors, essayists, orators, and historians have exhausted the resources of art and language in picturing its actors and scenes, and in celebrating the real and too frequently fictitious exploits which the Union troops performed. Essentially, he's saying, and so many Confederate veterans would say as well, it is now our opportunity to write the narrative. And that would, of course, be what we know today as the lost cause narrative, which, as many historians will point out today, was not really about loss anymore. It was about a victory over Reconstruction. And now we start to see, along with that, an interest in erecting more Confederate monuments, especially in town squares across the South, but also on battlefields, including like here at Gettysburg. In 1885, these three men, John Vanderslice, going left to right here, John Vanderslice, Edward McPherson, John Batchelder, each playing key roles in the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, will receive a request from veterans of the 1st Maryland Battalion, which became known as the 2nd Maryland Infantry in 1864 and served as that for the duration of the conflict. On August 11th, 1885, they received a letter requesting permission to erect a memorial to the 2nd Maryland Confederate Regiment. They wanted it to be 9 feet 6 inches tall with a 5 foot 4 inch square base to stand at the site of their furthest advance overlooking Pardee Field. Well, that's denied. Many of you know about the line of battle rule. You have to place your monument where you began your advance, where your line of battle originated. You can't be within Union lines if you're a Confederate regiment, for instance. So that initial request is going to be denied. But they did offer the opportunity to form a committee and ask to, in their words, visit the field before locating the site of the monument. The following spring, on April 30th, 1886, a committee of 3 Maryland veterans attends the Battlefield Memorial Association meeting, visits the field with the association's own committee of 3 to select a correct historical site for the monument. Now, on your left-hand side, we have a Robert Knox-Sneeden battle map. You can see the area circled says rebels here all night. That's the Union breastwork that the Marylanders took on the night of July 2nd. They wanted to place their monument beyond that, the point of their furthest advance, July 3rd. On your right side, we can see a map from early 1900s of where the monument was eventually placed. Now, it's hard to put these two maps together with modern roads and battle lines, but essentially the monument is agreed to eventually go at that point where they initially broke through the Union barricade, but it's not without some controversy of its own. May 7th, 1886, the initial location, that point of furthest advance, was denied on account of being within the Union lines on Culp's Hill. The GBMA countered by recommending it be erected at the point where the regiment entered and occupied our line, the Union line, on the night of July 2nd, and that an additional marker could be placed on the extreme advance position. And that is ultimately what happens. If you drive Slocum Avenue today, going up from the lower summit of Culp's Hill to the spot where it sort of levels out a bit, Pardee Field's off to your left, you're starting to curve around, you go past the Confederate monument, the main monument to the Marylanders, and then you come across their advance marker. That advance marker is where they wanted the monument to go initially, but that was denied. On June 4th, 1886, they're still settling exactly where this will go. And then unfortunately, we have either no meetings held or there are no minutes recorded between October 1st, 1886 and January 29th, 1887. And this leaves out the entire period when the 2nd Maryland Monument was actually erected and dedicated, November 19th, 1886. So we don't exactly know the full details of the deal that was struck, how they eventually agreed to place this monument, not at the initial line of battle, which would have been back closer to Benner's Hill, Rock Creek, but now had it within Union lines. So ultimately the monument is placed there, and of course it still stands there today at what was seen as a relatively controversial location. The text on the monument is standard fare for battlefield monuments, offering the name of the regiment, of course, the Maryland seal there, a list of officers, of unit designations, a general idea of what the regiment did on the Gettysburg battlefield, as well as casualty figures. So at face value, there is nothing necessarily objectionable. We can also see some evidence of a compromise. We can see that their designation during the battle, the 1st Maryland Battalion, partly to do with the fact that there are other 1st Marylands and federal forces here, partly to do with the fact that the name changed. We can see that both names are going to be mentioned here. 1st Maryland changed to 2nd Maryland Infantry, Confederate States of America. Despite the appearance of the monument not being necessarily objectionable, though, that it exists at all is going to cause some controversy almost immediately. Now, J. Howard Wirt, offering a local Gettysburgian's perspective, an abolitionist one at that, rather interestingly, when he learns that this monument is going to be erected, doesn't seem to have any problem with it. He says, in fact, the indication of the line of the Army of Northern Virginia will become general can scarcely be yet determined. Should such be the case, it will add to the historic interest of the field. He thinks Confederate markers are important so that we could understand that there were two sides of the Battle of Gettysburg. But as word starts to travel nationally that this monument is going to be erected, we can see the account on your right side from a Vermont newspaper, the Watchman and State Journal, which would say that it is carrying things too far to perpetuate the spirit of rebellion by a monument. So far as possible, future generations should be reminded only of the triumph of the Union people through the dignified exaltation of Northern patriotism and simple, tender respect for Southern bravery. This becomes a popular opinion, as we will see, especially by Union veterans. We can acknowledge, they say, the line of thinking goes, they were brave men against whom we fought, but we don't really like the idea of them dedicating their own monuments, of them creating their own rationale, rhetoric, narrative for what happened here at Gettysburg. Now, November 16th, 1886, 3 days before the monument itself is dedicated, there is what I would liken, as we read the text of the full address that is delivered that night, it's sort of a pep rally, to use a modern term. Bradley Johnson, the original commander of the 1st Maryland Infantry, he's not able to attend the November 19th dedication at Gettysburg. So he gives a send-off 3 days before these folks make their way to Gettysburg, and this is in Baltimore. And he gives a speech that he doesn't really focus much on Gettysburg. That's the point of why he's talking, is the Gettysburg Monument. But he mostly talks about reasserting Southern political power. He talks about the righteousness of the Confederate cause. And he has lines like this one. He says, "We are often asked why we persist in maintaining Confederate societies, why we every year make public demonstrations of our respect for the lost cause. I have been asked why not let the Confederacy rest in peace. My answer is, the cause of the Confederate States will never be a lost cause. For as long as men all over the world love liberty, they will struggle for it, and they will respect those who dared at great cost to stand in defense of it against overwhelming odds and irresistible force." It's a forceful speech about rights, not specifically about the tactics of a battle at Gettysburg and why it's important to dedicate a monument showing the Marylanders' contributions there. He would say at one point in his speech that if Marylanders continued to be treated as rebels and traitors rather than as soldiers, he makes a veiled threat to violently bring back some semblance of the Confederacy on account, in his words, of being able to retain our swords at the surrenders of 1865. And he would also say that it was, despite his assurance that the Union men of Maryland would be accorded the highest patriotism and the noblest courage in defense of opinions, he also said, "We can show that we have power, and power always compels respect." In his eyes, having a monument at Gettysburg was just as much to do with power as it was to the men to whom the monument was dedicated. Again, this is post-Reconstruction. This is a moment when Confederate veterans are starting to see themselves in a different light, accepting more tenets of what, of course, is already known at that period as the lost cause. He would say as well that I hope our demonstration for Friday to Gettysburg will be impressive in its size and earnestness. And as you can see there in the other highlighted section, he demands respect, equal recognition, and respect. Now on November 19th, 1886, again, the 23rd anniversary of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, something that rubs some Union veterans the wrong way, but that's the day that is chosen for the dedication of this monument to Confederate veterans. We'll see about 2,000 attendees. Again, standard fare for a monument dedication, ladies' aid organizations and veterans organizations, present military units, bands, orators, locals from Gettysburg as well as Frederick and Baltimore. They'll arrive via the railroad. They'll march, they'll organize down Carlisle Street from the train station, connect to Baltimore Street. They go up and over Cemetery Hill, which at that point at the National Cemetery, the flag is flying at half staff in honor of former President Chester Arthur, who had just died a day earlier of a cerebral hemorrhage. So the flag is at half staff. And then they'll make their way across Baltimore Pike and up the slopes of Culp's Hill. And when they do so, George Stewart, who commanded their brigade at Gettysburg, he's up there to greet the veterans at the monument. Veterans are carrying the flags of the regiment, both the first national flag that the men of this unit carried. I don't believe that at Gettysburg they carried a Confederate battle flag, a St. Andrew's Cross flag. It does not appear they got one until they were the 2nd Maryland Infantry in 1864. But they are also going to carry, according to the Baltimore Sun accounts that we have, the flag on your right there, a silk flag with the state of Maryland seal upon it. As they approach the monument and go through the course of the dedication itself, we're going to see these three men play key roles. Master of Ceremonies, the man on your left, George Stewart, again, former brigade commander. Randolph McKim, now a reverend at a church in New Orleans, pictured in the center. He's going to be the officiant of the ceremonies. And the keynote speaker is going to be George Thomas, not that George Thomas, not the Rock of Chickamauga, but the Marylanders, George Thomas, the man on your right-hand side there. And he gives a 45-minute speech. He talks about the beauty of the battlefield itself, talks about the bravery of the soldiers, gives a narration of the battle, really sort of standard fare. There's nothing outside the ordinary for this monument dedication, aside from the fact that there are men of both sides, including some of the Maryland Union veterans who fought against these Maryland Confederate soldiers are there as well. He says at the end of his speech, he says that we can no longer say as Confederate veterans that we will get the question, you failed. We can say not so, not so. So they see this as a victory narrative. This is showing that we did not lose. Our monument is on the field right here amid the line that we took that night of July 2nd. There's immediately pushback from the local press, especially from local leaders. David Bueller, part of the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, was postmaster in Gettysburg for a while, was the editor of the Star and Sentinel, one of the town's progressive Republican papers. He would write on December 13th, about a month after the monument was dedicated. He says that during the dedication, it was amazing to hear the most preposterous and absurd claims. The Marylanders, he said, were simply trying to magnify it as something grand and heroic, their contribution to the battle. The aim of the Maryland Regiment and the erection of their monument was not so much to mark their position as to glorify their achievements on this field, which induced me to call a halt on the proposition to open up the field to the erection of Confederate monuments. And others would write similar sort of things to John Batchelder, of course, an influential early Gettysburg historian, the eventual government historian of the battle. Others would call this monument and the speeches delivered at it vulgar and bogus. There will be objections by Union veterans themselves to the creation of this monument. Dozens of veterans addresses, especially at Culp's Hill, especially amid the Confederate monument, which in this postcard is off to your right side there. In 1888, 1889, the years that immediately followed this, 25th, 26th anniversary of the battle, New York and Pennsylvania dedicate most of their monuments. And we can see them disparaging their former rebel foes with words like victims of disloyalty, ignorance and superstition, internal dissension, insurrection, rebellious hordes for unholy conquest, evil spirits with hellish intent, and the vanquished. And they declared, did a few of these veterans, that treason was treason and loyalty was loyalty. And in the case of another man, he told his fellow Union veterans, you fought for the right and they fought for the wrong. No one gets to the point of the monument itself perhaps more succinctly or directly than Thomas Merchant, a veteran of the 84th Pennsylvania, who said the words you can see on your screen The government should have swept from its soil the first monument to rebellion with the warning that the placing of the second would be known as treason. No monument to treason should have been permitted a place on this or any other field, and being here should be returned to the donors, not to be erected elsewhere. We will see this play out in the Grand Army of the Republic, that most venerable, that largest, most influential veterans organization that comes out of the Civil War. And in particular, the Grand Army of the Republic, Post 88, the Abe Patterson Post, out of Allegheny, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Pittsburgh today, is going to issue what you see on your screen, a declaration filed to the Battlefield Memorial Association that says in part that it felt that the Maryland Regiment was commemorating the disloyal deeds, their disloyal deeds on this battlefield. Every indication that other rebel organizations and regiments will, if permitted, follow the example and thus undertake to make treason honorable. Therefore, be it resolved that we, composed of men who gave their best service in defense of the flag, many of whom shed their blood on the battlefield of Gettysburg, desire to enter their solemn protest against this sacrilege and most emphatically denounce any intrusion by traitors upon sacred soil, and ask that the GBMA, the chairman of which is our worthy governor and comrade, James Beaver, himself a Gettysburg veteran, cause the said rebel monument to be removed and express orders given that no more of that nature be erected. They would say in a follow-up to this that they believe, in their words, we reiterate, we are opposed to the erection of monuments, whether great or small, upon the battlefield of Gettysburg or any place that will be in the slightest degree making glorious the deeds of those who trampled underfoot the national ensign. We believe in making treason odious. James Beaver himself, governor of Pennsylvania, Gettysburg veteran, would respond, I am strongly in favor of the government making appropriations to erect markers on positions occupied by Confederate commands as a matter of history, that is, interpretive markers, not monuments. But I am and always will be opposed to any rebel organization erecting its own monuments. Across the country, this will spark widespread protests, especially after Pennsylvania Day, 1889. 50,000 Pennsylvania veterans and their family members visit Gettysburg to dedicate their monuments. They all see the Maryland Monument on Culp's Hill, and they all start petitioning the GBMA to remove the Confederate monument. Newspaper correspondents are going to start editorializing, including many of the headlines you can see on your screen. These and others included rebel monuments offensive, opposing the rebel monument, no rebel memorial, the sting of sectional bitterness, no room for rebels. Even the dead are hated still. One that simply says that monument. No charity for rebels, no rebel monuments at Gettysburg, want no Confederate monuments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a national debate, very much like what we have today, and it is Union veterans that are leading this charge. One veteran of the 22nd Massachusetts would say that I emphatically disapprove of any monuments which shall teach the present or coming generations false history. And I believe, do many Union veterans along those lines, that keeping this monument or allowing Confederate regiments themselves to dedicate monuments, that is going to create a false sense of history. It will look like a Confederate victory at what is supposed to be this Union Veterans Memorial Park. But there is some support by veterans, by the press. Gettysburg is going to have Henry Stahl, that extremely conservative, quite prejudicial editor of the Compiler. He called the issue simply nonsense in a piece about it. The Patterson Post, which had that initial GAR protest, received other insults toward their manliness and soldierly attributes. One Confederate veteran questioned the suspicion of the sincerity of their patriotism and things along those lines. There's largely a support, but we can generally see as we wind down here and move into how this can be looked at today as three camps that are going to emerge. The first is the minority who wish to allow Confederate veterans to dedicate as many monuments as they wanted, as many as they could afford, and essentially wherever they wanted to put them, so long as it fell into the line of battle rule. That's a minority opinion, but it is one. Some Union veterans who just have kind of a laissez-faire view, erect them wherever you want to. It's veterans' battlefield. The second is a small but rather vocal group that didn't want Confederate monuments at Gettysburg at all. The folks we just heard from, another veteran from Ohio who says that I trust we shall never see a Confederate monument along our line. They just don't think that they should be here at all. But the third is the more nuanced solution, and it is eventually what will win out. It's the largest sect which wants to bar Confederate veterans themselves from erecting monuments, but instead have objective interpretive markers by a consolidated organization, be it the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, or how this will eventually play out, the United States War Department and the precursor to Gettysburg National Military Park that we have today. That is eventually what will happen. Influential Gettysburg veterans are very much on board with this. Oliver Howard, former 11th Corps commander, says that he thinks this would be unobjectionable to all parties. Others would say, I have said to myself, when I go to Gettysburg again, I would like to show my friends the army commanded by Lee was really there. The plan you propose should be done. Another person says this is not a matter of sentiment, but of history, and absolutely necessary if the history is to be complete and this be made permanent. And that is ultimately what will play out. The Maryland Monument stays. It becomes featured in more travelogues. It becomes mentioned in memoirs, such as that by Robert Beecham, a soldier who fought right here on Seminary Ridge, an abolitionist himself who leads Black men in battle. But in his memoir, he mentions a little bit about the Confederate monument and doesn't seem totally opposed to it. Then we also see Confederate monument travelogues, such as the one on your right side, published in 1911, which is very much in favor of seeing this Maryland Confederate monument, wants to see others like it. And then you have magazines like the Railroad Trainmen in the center, which is a rail magazine focused on towns that will be passed if you're on a train. And it says one of the things definitely to see at Gettysburg, because it's unique, is that there is a Confederate monument on the slopes of Culp's Hill. Just to look at a few then and now, this is from the Pennsylvania Trainmen, the article that they produced in 1912 with sort of a general view, similar view of the monument today. Looking across the side of Culp's Hill, slightly different angles here with the 29th Pennsylvania monument there at the left. This is an 1880s, 1890s likely image. We can look across where the image on the left there from 1868 talks about the Confederate breastworks or Union breastworks that Confederate soldiers take, kind of looking south in the modern image there toward the Maryland Monument, the top of which is barely visible to the back left of the image there. And of course, a more direct view of then and now. A 1913 image of the monument, we can see how the tree line has certainly changed in the century plus since that period. As we wind down the last couple of moments here, and then I'll certainly open it up to any questions that anyone has. In 1887, we will see the next Confederate monument. And it's the one that you see dedicated on your left there, Lewis Armistead. Of course, there's an interesting story in its own right of Union veterans in part funding the Confederate monument. Of course, there's a debate over its precise location, whether it is where Lewis Armistead did in fact fall. But John Batchelder, in organizing that event, that reunion between Pickett's division men on the Confederate side, Philadelphia Brigade men on the Union side, he would say in 1887 that I, in his words, received bushels of letters from the North protesting against the Confederate monument at Gettysburg. Some of the writers even intimating they were bitterly opposed even to the Confederate committee visiting Gettysburg. But this will not stall or stop the process of Confederate monumentation. Perhaps most famously, the dedication on your right side in 1917 of the Virginia Memorial with Robert E. Lee on top. But even that was a long, sustained process. The Confederate battle flag, not allowed to be on that monument. The original inscription on the monument, not allowed to be there, had to be changed. No censure or blame, says the Battlefield Memorial Association and the War Department. So all of these dedications that come from then until now are not without their own form of controversy. It all began with this Maryland monument, this first Confederate monument on the Gettysburg battlefield. And in so many ways, like the marker that you see pictured in the center, these objective War Department markers are the lasting legacy of the first Maryland monument, or at least the debate that came out after it. The nuanced discussion among veterans was that these objective markers would be placed. But ultimately today, there are 21 Confederate monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield, some of which have a dark side to them. The dedication of the Virginia Memorial, for instance, its keynote order, Lee Robinson, a Confederate veteran who actually served in the Richmond Howitzers here on the seminary campus, would say in part that he felt that what the Confederate soldiers were fighting for was to keep men enslaved. He said that Lee's army was fighting to conquer the Africans, his words, that Southern slavery will hold up to the noblest amelioration of an inferior race of which history can take note. We were fighting to keep in chains a race incapable of self-government, and the only freedom they deserved was the freedom to rot. These things come about in the relatively unadulterated means by which Confederate veterans are eventually able to erect the monuments that they do here at Gettysburg. All of that, though, is to say, in concluding, that most of the Confederate monuments that you see when you travel about the battlefield have only been there since 1961. The vast majority of the monuments that are here, 7 of the 21, are the only ones dedicated by Confederate veterans themselves. The debates, the window of discussion, the means by which we discuss these events have certainly changed since veterans of the Civil War died, since they no longer oversaw the narrative that we see on the Gettysburg battlefield. And this chart gives you one means by which to kind of visualize that. The last thing that I will note here, as I've gone a bit over my time, and I apologize for that, everyone, is that in his keynote address at the dedication of the 1st Maryland Battalion Monument tomorrow in 1886, he said on that occasion, 136 years ago, I believe, if my math is correct, he says, "I've been honored far above my deserving in having been selected as the organ of your feelings and affections on any occasions such as this." But his lasting impact, he said, was, "It is my duty and my pleasure to turn over this memorial as an added page to the great record you have in charge, a record that belongs to no section and to no time, the joint heritage of the North and the South, and of right to be transmitted in all its fullness to the ages yet to come." And right, wrong, or indifferent, however we want to interpret that statement, how he felt about the purpose that this monument had, this is an important reminder that we need to objectively access these stories. We need to look at all of their complexities, all of their fullness together through discussions like presentations like we're having this evening. We can hear the words of the men and women themselves, those who fought and died, those who built and threatened to tear down, those who supported, and those who protested. Debates we are still having today on either side of any one of those matters. We are the ages yet to come of whom Thomas spoke that November day. And regardless of where on the spectrum of historical memory we individually or collectively fall, I think we would all do well to remember our role in this ever-going story. So I thank you all very much for being here this evening. If you have any questions, again, I apologize for running over a bit, but I'll be happy to take those.
Hey, Cody.
Yep.
Okay. One question in the chat. When Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy toured the field, did they visit the Maryland 2nd CSA monument?
Good question. Yeah, I don't know. I would wonder that as well. And yeah, what their thoughts are on it. And of course, by then there are multiple Confederate monuments and increasingly in the decades to follow. But this particular one, I'm not sure. I've not seen anything that suggests that, but I'll have to look into it.
Okay, thank you.
It said that the original inscription on the Virginia monument was not allowed. It says now to Virginia, to her sons at Gettysburg. What was the original supposed to say?
It was something along the lines of the word glory or glorious was in there. It was about the Confederate cause. And I forget the exact inscription, but it's shot down. And actually, if you go to the Gettysburg National Military Park website, they've done a wonderful job over the past couple of years of digitizing so many of the pieces of correspondence about a lot of the Confederate state memorials, including Virginia. And a lot of the correspondence is there, and you can see the very minute details that were concerning to both sides, and until they eventually landed on the modern inscription to Virginia and her sons at Gettysburg. We can see a similar sort of thing with the flag debate. The initial plan is to have the Confederate battle flag on the front. They land on the Commonwealth of Virginia flag. Yes, thank you, Rob, for posting that in the chat there. Yep. So if you look at the Virginia Monument and other monuments, and then the link there, I forget the exact verbiage, but it was something about the glorious cause, something along those lines.
There's a lot in there. That's cool. I didn't know that was there.
Yeah, they've done a wonderful job. That's relatively new, just the past couple of years.
Does anybody else have any questions? Some approbation in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Well, if there are no others, if you do have any questions, oh, there's a couple of coming in. All right, wonderful. So what role and influence did powerful politicians play in the erection and approval of Confederate monuments in the 1960s and forward? Rayburn, Gore Sr., Helms, Lott, etc.
Yeah, in some cases, I'll point specifically to Alabama, for instance. We can see the likes of George Wallace getting involved to the point that he actually is the keynote speaker. There's a wonderful piece from the Cupola, Gettysburg College's scholarly online publication, where they talk about it's about George Wallace being there for the dedication of the Alabama Memorial. Beyond that, I don't know of particulars, but I think that in most cases you can see heavy influence from well-known names in southern states in particular, especially amid the Civil War centennial. But some would obviously point to the fact, rightfully so, that coincides with the Civil Rights Movement, with the Civil Rights Revolution. The midst of the major years of that are as these Confederate monuments are being erected, not just at Gettysburg, but elsewhere as well. The size of Confederate state monuments increases over time, and they're dedicated, of course, until relatively recently, even beyond that period. I'll have to look into another great question that will give me some good homework to look into particulars of some of these individuals.
Any particular reason why Mississippi and Louisiana refused to join other southern states in erecting monuments in the 60s?
I think in large part, what we start to see after there's one after another dedicated, relatively speaking, every few years, essentially, largely due to finances. And then if you look at a lot of that National Park Service, the Gettysburg National Military Park documentation, you can see just how much thought goes into the design of every one of these monuments. And even for relatively non-controversial things, what I mean by that are they're not debating the causes and consequences of the war in every one of these cases, like they are on the Virginia Memorial, for instance. But even just the design of the monument goes back and forth, and that delays the process. You can even see this in non-Confederate cases. There are 3 Pennsylvania Division Commander monuments that go up in the 19-teens, are delayed because their dedications are delayed because of the First World War. And in the case of at least Alexander Hayes, not dedicated until 1982. And in the case of, I believe it's John Gibbon, maybe, at least one of them is never dedicated. And John White Geary was relatively recently as well. And so there's a lot of just kind of bureaucratic back and forth in the case of so many of these monuments.
Any other questions? If not, if you think of any, you have our email, info@seminaryridgemuseum.org. You're always welcome to send in questions. Otherwise, we appreciate your joining us. And one more. Okay. Was there any issues over Maryland state monuments being erected in 1994? Not
that I'm aware. That is a good question. I've tried to look in. The nice thing about 19th century journalism is, of course, is because it is so much editorializing. It's really easy to find what were at least the hardline opinions on both the left and the right, as it were. As we get into more modern times, say what we will, and that's a debate for another time about partisanship in journalistic sources today. By and large, straightforward journalism being relatively objective is far more common now. And so what we don't have in 1994, where I'm going with this, what we don't have in 1994 that we would have had 100 years earlier is the first place we can go to get the pulse on controversy surrounding monuments are oftentimes to editorial pages in newspapers. I haven't delved terribly deeply into 1994, but at face value, from what I can tell, I don't see that it's terribly controversial. And in part, it's probably because it's to both sides. We do see a bit of a less controversial tone when a monument is dedicated to both sides.
Thank you. Well, I believe that wraps our second History Happy Hour for the season. Hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks for the Gettysburg Christmas Festival. If not, registration will open in the first week of December for Pete's History Happy Hour on, I believe, December 16th. So yeah, it was right up there on the screen. So thank you all very much for your support. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we look forward to seeing you on the Ridge soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, you guys too.
Thank you.